Rain pounded against the cracked neon sign of the diner, drowning out the distant sirens. Emily was just trying to finish her double shift when a shivering, confused old man stumbled through the door. Offering him a warm cup of coffee was an act of kindness that would throw her directly into the crosshairs of Chicago's most ruthless syndicate. The smell of stale grease and black coffee clung to Emily Higgins like a second skin. It was pushing 2 in the morning on a brutal Tuesday in November, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan was rattling the single-pane windows of Lou's Counter, a decaying 2-4-hour diner nestled in a forgotten pocket of the South Side. Emily dragged a damp rag across the Formica counter, her pale blue uniform stained with ketchup and exhaustion. She was 23, living paycheck to paycheck, and desperately trying to keep the eviction notices off her apartment door. The diner was entirely empty, save for Jimmy, the shift manager, who was snoring softly in the back booth over a ledger. Emily was just reaching to flip the open sign when the heavy glass door shoved violently inward. A gust of freezing rain blew into the diner, carrying with it a frail figure. It was an elderly man, perhaps in his late 70s. He was dressed completely inappropriately for the Chicago winter, wearing only a thin, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, a white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and expensive leather loafers that were soaked through with gray slush. He had no coat, no umbrella, and he was trembling so violently that his teeth chattered in a visible, rhythmic staccato. Emily immediately dropped her rag and rushed around the counter. "Sir? Oh my God, sir! You're freezing!" The old man blinked at her. His eyes were a milky, clouded brown, swimming with a profound and terrifying confusion. He looked around the shabby diner as if he had just been dropped onto an alien planet. "The birds," he mumbled, his voice carrying a faint, gravelly Italian lilt. "I was supposed to feed the birds by the fountain. But the stone, it's so cold." "There are no birds out tonight, sweetie," Emily said softly, instinctively taking his icy hands and rubbing them between her own. "You need to sit down before you fall." She guided him to a booth near the radiator. As he slid into the cracked vinyl seat, Jimmy woke up with a snort. The manager peered over the back of the booth, his expression instantly souring. "Hey, Emily. What is this? We ain't a homeless shelter. Tell him to buy something or get out." "Jimmy, look at him," Emily hissed, keeping her voice low. "He's freezing. He's confused. He doesn't even have a coat." "Not my problem," Jimmy grunted, crossing his arms. "He smells like wet dog, and he's scaring away paying customers." "There are no paying customers," Emily shot back, her temper flaring. She took a deep breath, reaching into her apron. She pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, half of her tips for the entire agonizing 12-hour shift. She slammed it on the counter. "He's paying. Get me a bowl of the chicken soup, extra hot, and a black coffee." Jimmy muttered a curse under his breath, snatched the bill, and trudged toward the kitchen. Emily turned back to the old man. She grabbed a handful of paper napkins and gently dabbed the freezing rain from his silver hair. Up close, she noticed details that didn't match the profile of a vagrant. His watch, peeking out from the soaked cuff of his shirt, was a heavy, gold Patek Philippe. The fabric of his suit, though ruined by the weather, felt like spun silk. "My name is Emily," she said, keeping her tone light and soothing. "What's your name?" The man stared at his trembling hands. "Silas," he whispered. I think I'm lost. I was looking for Rosa. She told me to wait by the fountain." Emily felt a sharp pang in her chest. The way he spoke of Rosa, with a mixture of desperate longing and profound grief, told Emily that Rosa was likely gone. "Well, Silas, you're safe here. We're going to get you warmed up." When Jimmy slammed the soup and coffee on the table, Emily sat across from Silas and helped him hold the heavy ceramic mug. As the heat seeped into his bones, some of the color returned to his pale, papery cheeks. He ate the soup slowly, his confusion occasionally breaking to reveal a sharp, piercing intellect before the fog rolled back over his mind. "You have kind eyes," Silas said suddenly, his gaze focusing entirely on Emily. "Like my son." "No, not my son. He has his mother's eyes. Cold, sharp. But he is a good boy. He worries too much. I'm sure he's worried sick about you right now, Emily said. Do you know his phone number? Or an address? I can call a cab. Silas shook his head, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a heavy, solid silver money clip. There was no cash in it, just an engraved crest, a stylized wolf over a thorny rose. He set it on the table. He will find me. He always finds me. Dominic never stops. The name didn't mean anything to Emily. She just saw a vulnerable, lost father. As the clock struck 3 a.m., Jimmy emerged from the back with his coat on. Shift's over, Emily. Lock up. The stray has to go. Emily nodded. She couldn't leave Silas on the street, and she couldn't take him to her tiny apartment. Her landlord was already looking for a reason to kick her out. She pulled out her flip phone and dialed the non-emergency police line, hoping an officer could take him to a safe precinct until his family was located. While she waited on hold, she unraveled her own thick burgundy wool scarf from her neck, a hand-knit gift from her late grandmother, and wrapped it securely around Silas's neck, tucking it into his suit jacket. Keep this on, Silas, she murmured. 15 minutes later, a local patrol car pulled up to the diner. Emily walked Silas to the door. The old man suddenly gripped her hand with surprising strength. He pressed the silver money clip into her palm. For the soup, he whispered. I can't take this, Emily protested. But Silas was already being gently guided into the back of the cruiser by a tired-looking beat cop. Emily stood in the freezing rain, watching the taillights fade into the darkness. She shivered, clutching the heavy silver clip, entirely unaware that across the street, idling in the shadows of an abandoned storefront, a matte black Lincoln Navigator had been recording her every move. The diner was a different beast at noon. It was loud, chaotic, and smelled heavily of frying bacon and bleach. Emily was running on 3 hours of sleep, her feet aching in her scuffed, non-slip shoes as she balanced 3 plates of hash browns up her arm. She was just dropping off a check at booth 4 when the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. It wasn't a sound, but rather a sudden, suffocating absence of it. The clatter of silverware stopped. The low hum of conversation died in the throats of the regulars. Emily turned toward the entrance. 3 men had stepped into the diner. They didn't fit the South Side aesthetic. They were massive, clad in tailored, dark, expensive overcoats that couldn't quite hide the bulk of their shoulders or the unnatural rigidity at their waistlines, the clear outline of concealed firearms. 2 of the men stepped to the sides, securing the door and the rear exit. The 3rd man walked slowly toward the center of the diner. He was strikingly handsome, perhaps in his early 30s, with jet black hair swept back and eyes the color of shattered ice. His jawline looked like it had been carved from marble, and his expression was a terrifying mask of absolute, chilling calm. He exuded an aura of authority so heavy it made Emily want to hold her breath. Jimmy came scrambling out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his face pale and sweating. Sir, gentlemen, can I help you? We're a little busy. The man with the icy eyes didn't even look at Jimmy. He raised a hand, 2 fingers extended. Quiet. Jimmy snapped his mouth shut, retreating a step. The man's gaze swept the room, dismissive of the terrified patrons, until his eyes locked onto Emily. He reached into the inner pocket of his cashmere coat and pulled out a familiar object. It was the burgundy, hand-knit scarf. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a hesitant step forward. That's my scarf. The man's eyes narrowed. He walked slowly toward her, stopping just inches away. Up close, he smelled of expensive cologne, rain, and something metallic, like gunpowder. My name is Dominic Moretti, he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded the room. And I have a few questions about how my father ended up at a police precinct wearing your clothing. Emily swallowed hard. The name clicked. Dominic. The son Silas had mentioned. But the reality of Dominic Moretti was a far cry from the worried, loving son she had pictured. He was lost, Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. He came in here freezing. He didn't have a coat. I bought him soup and gave him the scarf so he wouldn't freeze before the police picked him up. Dominic stared at her, unblinking. You expect me to believe you didn't know who he was? You didn't recognize Silas Moretti? No, Emily said, crossing her arms defensively. Should I have? One of the men by the door, a burly man with a scarred eyebrow named Leo, let out a dark chuckle. Dominic didn't break eye contact. People don't just stumble upon the former head of the Moretti family without an agenda, Dominic said softly, leaning in slightly. My father suffers from dementia. He slipped his security detail yesterday evening. We spent 8 hours tearing the city apart looking for him. And suddenly, he turns up, safe, fed, and wrapped in cheap wool, babbling about an angel at a diner. Dominic reached into his coat again, pulling out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. He dropped it onto a nearby table with a heavy thud. It had to be at least $10,000. Who paid you? Dominic demanded, his voice dropping an octave, turning lethal. Was it the O'Bannon crew? Did they grab him, realize it was too hot, and use you as the drop? Tell me right now, and you get to keep the cash in your life. Emily looked at the money, then back up at Dominic's cold, accusatory eyes. Exhaustion, poverty, and fear suddenly boiled over into blinding anger. She picked up the stack of bills and shoved it hard against Dominic's chest. He caught it instinctively, looking momentarily shocked by her audacity. I don't know who the hell you think you are, Emily snapped, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry. And I don't care who your father is. He was an old man, shivering in the cold, and he thought he was supposed to feed birds at a fountain. I didn't want a reward, and I sure as hell don't want your blood money. Now, unless you're ordering a coffee, get out of my diner. The silence that followed was deafening. Jimmy looked like he was about to faint. Leo's hand drifted slowly toward the inside of his jacket. Dominic held up his hand, stopping his men. He looked at Emily, really looked at her. He took in her frayed cuffs, the dark circles under her eyes, the genuine outrage in her posture. The suspicion in his icy eyes slowly cracked, replaced by something much more dangerous. Intrigue. Before Dominic could speak, Leo's earpiece buzzed. The scarred man tapped it, listened for a second, and his face hardened. He quickly closed the distance to Dominic, leaning in to whisper rapidly in Italian. Emily couldn't understand the words, but she saw Dominic's jaw clench. The air around him grew instantly, violently cold. Dominic turned back to Emily. It seems, he said, slipping the stack of cash back into his pocket, that your act of charity was noticed by the wrong people. The O'Bannons had spotters on this street last night. They saw my father go in here. They saw him with you. I don't understand, Emily stammered, the anger draining away, replaced by a sudden, icy dread. The O'Bannons are our rivals, Dominic stated bluntly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. My father is my only weakness. If they think you have some connection to him, or if they think you saw something, you are a loose end. And the O'Bannons tie up loose ends by burning them to the ground. Emily backed up until her hips hit the counter. I didn't see anything. I don't know anything. They don't care, Dominic said. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. You saved my father's life last night. I owe a debt, and a Moretti always pays his debts. He reached out, his large, gloved hand wrapping firmly around her upper arm. It wasn't rough, but it was an immovable, unyielding grip. Grab your things, Emily, Dominic ordered. You're coming with us. What? No. I have a shift. I can't just leave. You don't have a choice, Dominic said, his voice softening just a fraction, a dark promise lacing his words. Unless you want to be dead before your shift ends. You belong to the Moretti family now. The ride north on Lakeshore Drive was suffocatingly silent. Emily sat perfectly still in the back of the armored Mercedes-Benz G-Class, her hands tightly folded in her lap to stop them from shaking. Beside her, Dominic Moretti was a study in predatory stillness, his eyes fixed on the gray, churning waters of Lake Michigan. In the front, Leo drove with methodical precision, while another man, introduced briefly as Carmine, monitored a police scanner and a GPS tablet. Emily's mind raced. She had left her purse, her keys, and her entire life back at Lou's counter. You can't just kidnap me, she finally whispered, breaking the heavy silence. I have rights. I have a landlord who expects rent. Dominic turned his head slowly. The icy blue of his eyes softened just a fraction, though his voice remained entirely devoid of warmth. Your landlord, Arthur Higgins, is your uncle. He's also 3 months behind on his property taxes and heavily indebted to a bookie in Cicero. I've already had a sum wired to his account. Your rent is covered for the next 5 years. Consider it severance from your previous life. Emily gasped, her anger momentarily overriding her fear. You investigated me? In the span of 9 hours? My father's life was compromised, Dominic stated flatly. I investigate the air he breathes. Before Emily could unleash the tirade building in her chest, Carmine's tablet chirped urgently. He tapped the screen, his thick neck going rigid. Boss, you need to see this. Carmine handed the tablet over the center console. Dominic took it, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles jumped. He stared at the screen for a long moment before silently passing the device to Emily. It was a live feed from a local news chopper. The headline scrolling at the bottom read, Southside Diner engulfed in blaze. Emily's stomach plummeted into an endless void. The screen showed the unmistakable, charred skeletal remains of Lou's counter. Plumes of thick, toxic black smoke billowed into the afternoon sky. Firefighters were dousing the wreckage, but there was nothing left to save. Jimmy, Emily choked out, clapping a hand over her mouth. Oh my God! Jimmy was still inside. Jimmy is fine, Dominic said coldly. In fact, Jimmy is the one who lit the match. Emily stared at him, bewildered. What? No. Jimmy is just a grumpy manager. He wouldn't. Jimmy has a severe gambling addiction, Dominic interrupted, his voice methodical and detached. He owed $50,000 to the O'Bannon syndicate. When the O'Bannon spotters saw my father in your diner last night, they didn't just watch. They approached your manager. Jimmy sold the security footage of you and my father to Liam O'Bannon. Then, to cover his tracks and destroy the original hard drives, he rigged the gas lines. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She was suddenly incredibly dizzy. If Dominic hadn't walked through those doors 20 minutes ago, she would have been wiping down the counters when the kitchen exploded. They think you know something, Dominic continued, taking the tablet back. Liam O'Bannon is a paranoid butcher. He assumes my father gave you a message, a bank account number, or a location. You are breathing right now, strictly because you are in this vehicle. The SUV veered off the highway, winding through the heavily wooded, affluent enclaves of Lake Forest, Illinois. They approached a massive set of wrought iron gates, bearing the same crest Emily had seen on the silver money clip. The Wolf and the Rose. The gates swung open silently, revealing a sprawling, limestone estate that looked more like a European fortress than a home in the American Midwest. Welcome to the compound, Dominic said, adjusting his cuffs. You will not leave the grounds. You will not use a telephone. You will be provided with whatever you need. If you follow these rules, you will survive. Inside, the house was a staggering display of wealth. Crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs that felt like clouds underfoot, and museum-quality Renaissance paintings. But Emily barely noticed. She felt like a canary carried into a coal mine. A silver-haired woman in a pristine housekeeper's uniform met them in the foyer. Take Miss Higgins to the East Wing guest suite, Maria, Dominic ordered. Burn the clothes she's wearing, and find her something appropriate from the storage. Wait, Emily said, finding her voice as Dominic turned to leave. Where is Silas? Is he okay? Dominic paused, his broad shoulders stiffening. He looked back at her, and for the first time, the impenetrable mask slipped, revealing a profound, exhausted vulnerability. He is resting. His mind, it comes and goes. The doctors say the cold accelerated the degeneration. He paused. He asked for you, but you will not see him until you are clean and fed. With that, he vanished into the labyrinth of the mansion. 3 days passed in a blur of terrifying luxury. Emily traded her grease-stained polyester uniform for soft, cashmere loungewear and silk blouses she recognized from fashion magazines. Stella McCartney, Prada. garments that cost more than her car. Yet, the silk felt like a straitjacket. She spent her time wandering the massive library or looking out the reinforced, bulletproof windows at the perimeter guards patrolling with assault rifles. On the fourth afternoon, Maria escorted Emily to the sunroom. There, sitting in a leather wheelchair and bathed in the pale winter light, was Silas Moretti. He looked even frailer than he had in the diner, a thick wool blanket draped over his lap. Emily approached slowly, crouching beside his chair. "Hello, Silas." The old man turned his head, his eyes, cloudy and distant, suddenly sharpened. A warm, fragile smile cracked his weathered face. "The angel," he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. "You gave me your scarf." It smelled like cinnamon and hard work. Emily smiled softly, taking his hand. "It's Emily. How are you feeling?" "Cold," Silas murmured, looking out the window. "Always cold now. Dominic tries, but he doesn't understand. He thinks I'm just a broken clock." He leaned in closer, his grip surprisingly tight. "I wasn't lost, Emily. I had to hide it. The wolf is at the door, but the rat is in the house." Emily frowned, her heart picking up speed. "What do you mean? What rat?" Silas shook his head, his eyes darting around the empty room with sudden, frantic paranoia. "The stone. I told you about the stone. Buckingham. The seahorses. Emily, I left the ledger where the water used to fall. Liam thinks he can bleed us dry. But I have the ledger. I just couldn't remember. I couldn't remember." His voice trailed off, the lucidity evaporating like mist as he stared blankly back out the window. Emily's breath hitched. Buckingham Fountain, the massive landmark in the center of Grant Park. The seahorses he mentioned were the bronze statues at its base. Silas hadn't been wandering aimlessly in dementia. He had used a moment of clarity to hide something crucial, a ledger, before his mind betrayed him again. And he had just told her there was a rat in the house, a mole inside the Moretti family. She stood up, determined to find Dominic. As she stepped out of the sunroom, she collided hard with a solid wall of muscle. It was Lorenzo, one of Dominic's most trusted captains. He was a sleek, handsome man, with slicked back hair, but his eyes were entirely dead. "Whoa there, sweetheart," Lorenzo said, his hands lingering a little too long on her arms as he steadied her. "Where's the fire?" "I need to speak to Dominic," Emily said, stepping back quickly, her skin crawling. "Boss is out," Lorenzo said smoothly, blocking the hallway. "Meeting with the commission downtown. Things are heating up with the O'Bannons. But you can tell me, what did the old man say?" Emily looked at Lorenzo. "The rat is in the house." Something about Lorenzo's posture, the overly casual tone of his voice, sent a massive spike of adrenaline through her veins. "Nothing." Emily lied smoothly, relying on years of deflecting drunk customers at the diner. "He just asked for some tea. I was going to find Maria." Lorenzo's eyes narrowed slightly, a terrifyingly cold calculation flashing behind them. "Maria went into town for groceries. I'll get the old man his tea. You go back to your room, Emily. It's not safe to wander." Emily nodded, forcing a polite smile, and walked toward the east wing. But the moment she turned the corner, she slipped off her expensive loafers. In her stocking feet, she moved silently back toward the sunroom. Pressing herself against the flocked wallpaper, she peeked around the doorframe. Lorenzo wasn't getting tea. He was standing over Silas, a leather pillow from the sofa gripped tightly in his hands. "Where is it, old man?" Lorenzo hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Liam is losing patience. Where did you hide the offshore accounts? Tell me, or I swear to God I'll snuff you out right now and tell Dominic your heart finally gave out." Silas just stared at him. Murmuring about the birds, Lorenzo snarled, raising the pillow to press it over the old man's face. Emily didn't think. The street-smart, fiercely protective instincts that had kept her alive on the South Side took over entirely. She lunged into the room, grabbing a heavy, solid bronze bookend, shaped like a globe from the nearest shelf. "Hey!" Emily screamed. Lorenzo whipped around, his eyes widening in shock. Emily swung the heavy bronze globe with all her might. It connected with a sickening crack against the side of Lorenzo's skull. The captain let out a grunt of pain, dropping the pillow and staggering backward, blood instantly welling at his temple. He recovered faster than she expected. With a roar of fury, Lorenzo lunged at her, backhanding her across the face. The force of the blow sent Emily crashing over a glass coffee table, shattering it into 1,000 glittering pieces. Pain exploded in her ribs, and her lips split open, tasting of copper. "You stupid little waitress," Lorenzo spat, drawing a suppressed Heckler & Koch pistol from his shoulder holster. "You should have stayed in your room." He pointed the gun directly at her chest. Before he could pull the trigger, the heavy oak doors of the sunroom were violently kicked open. Dominic stood in the doorway, a living incarnation of the Grim Reaper. His cashmere coat was flecked with rain, and his ice-blue eyes were ablaze with a murderous, unholy rage. Leo and Carmine poured in behind him, weapons drawn. Lorenzo froze, turning the gun toward Dominic, but he was entirely too late. Dominic didn't even blink. He raised his own weapon and fired once. The suppressed shot made a quiet fute sound. Lorenzo's knee shattered. The traitor screamed, collapsing to the floor. "Leo, take him to the basement," Dominic ordered, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority. "Make sure he stays conscious for a very, very long time." As Leo dragged the screaming, bleeding Lorenzo out of the room, Dominic immediately dropped his weapon and rushed to Emily. He fell to his knees beside the shattered glass, pulling her up and frantically checking her for gunshot wounds. "Emily. Emily. Look at me," he demanded, his hands trembling the first time she had ever seen him lose control. He gently touched her bleeding lip, his eyes dark with a storm of emotion. "Did he shoot you? Are you cut?" "I'm fine," Emily gasped, wincing as she clutched her bruised ribs. She looked up at him, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming intensity of his proximity. He was the mole, Dominic. He was working for O'Bannon. "He tried to kill your father." Dominic pulled her against his chest, holding her so tightly she could feel the heavy, erratic thud of his heart. It wasn't the embrace of a mafia boss to a captive. It was the desperate, fierce hold of a man who had nearly lost something irreplaceable. "I know," Dominic murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I caught one of his runners downtown an hour ago. I drove 100 miles an hour to get back here." He pulled back just enough to look fiercely into her eyes. "You saved him again. You saved my father." Emily caught her breath, looking deep into the icy blue eyes that were now entirely melted, burning with a fierce, protective fire. "Dominic," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Silas didn't forget everything. I know where the ledger is. I know how to destroy the O'Bannons." Dominic's ice-blue eyes snapped to Emily, the sheer intensity of his gaze temporarily eclipsing the chaos of the blood-stained sunroom. "Buckingham," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a loaded chamber. "The fountain in Grant Park." "Are you absolutely certain, Emily? Silas specifically mentioned the seahorses?" "Yes," Emily insisted, ignoring the throbbing pain in her ribs as she pushed herself up from the shattered glass. "He said he left the ledger where the water used to fall, under the stone by the seahorses. He was terrified that Liam O'Bannon would find it." Carmine stepped into the room, his phone pressed tight to his ear. He looked grim. "Boss, Leo just cracked Lorenzo in the basement." The rat sang. "Lorenzo tipped off the O'Bannon crew 20 minutes ago. Liam is mobilizing a team to downtown Chicago right now. They don't know exactly where the ledger is, but they are sweeping every landmark Silas frequented." Dominic's jaw clenched, the muscles ticking erratically. "Prepare the Audi. We leave in 2 minutes." He turned back to Emily, his expression hardening back into the ruthless syndicate leader she had met at the diner. "You stay here. Maria will tend to your face. The compound is on full lockdown." "Like hell I am," Emily fired back, grabbing the sleeve of his heavy cashmere coat. The sheer audacity of her defiance made Carmine blink in shock. "Silas told me about the stone. Do you know how massive Buckingham Fountain is? There are 4 different bronze seahorse statues and hundreds of loose limestone bricks. You'll be searching for hours in the dark. I know exactly how Silas described the angle of the streetlights hitting the stone." "You need me, Dominic." Dominic stared down at her. Her lip was split, her borrowed silk blouse was torn, and she looked exhausted, yet she burned with a fierce, unbreakable fire. A faint, dangerous smile ghosted across his lips. "If you get shot, Emily, I am going to be extremely irritated," Dominic murmured, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. He reached into his coat, pulling out a compact, black Sig Sauer P365, and pressed it into her hands. "Keep the safety on, unless someone who isn't me tries to grab you. Let's go." The drive back into the heart of Chicago was a masterclass in calculated terror. Dominic drove the matte black Audi RS6 Avant like a guided missile, weaving through the sparse, icy traffic on DuSable Lakeshore Drive. The winter storm had escalated, dumping a fresh sheet of snow over the city and turning the towering skyscrapers into ghostly, monolithic shadows against the night sky. They skidded to a halt on the edge of Grant Park. The sprawling park was entirely deserted, swallowed by the howling wind. In the center of the massive plaza sat Buckingham Fountain. Stripped of its cascading water for the winter, the towering, multi-tiered pink Georgia marble structure looked like the skeletal remains of a forgotten palace. "Move fast! Stay low!" Dominic commanded, racking the slide of his own weapon. Emily trudged through the ankle-deep snow, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She guided Dominic toward the northern edge of the lower basin. The massive bronze seahorse statues loomed in the darkness, their oxidized green surfaces dusted with white powder. He said the light from the Columbus Drive street lamp caught the crack in the stone. Emily shouted over the wind, dropping to her knees on the freezing marble. She frantically brushed the snow away from the base of the northernmost seahorse. Dominic knelt beside her, his broad shoulders shielding her from the biting wind. Together, their gloved hands felt along the freezing masonry. "Here!" Emily gasped. Her fingers had caught on a deep, unnatural fissure in one of the heavy limestone blocks. Dominic wedged his combat knife into the crack and pried with all his strength. With a harsh grating sound, the stone gave way. Beneath it, nestled in a dark, hollowed-out cavity, was a small, waterproof black pelican case. "You found it," Dominic breathed, pulling the heavy case free. He looked at Emily, genuine awe flashing in his eyes. "You actually found it." Before Emily could reply, a blinding, high-intensity spotlight hit them from the east. "I'll take that, Moretti." A booming, heavily accented voice echoed across the frozen plaza. Emily squeezed her eyes shut against the glare. 3 black Cadillac Escalades had quietly rolled onto the pedestrian pathways, boxing them in. Doors slammed, and a dozen heavily armed men piled out, their silhouettes stark against the halogen headlights. Stepping forward into the light was Liam O'Bannon. He was a towering, barrel-chested Irishman, wearing a vicuña wool overcoat, his red hair slicked back, and a sadistic, wide grin splitting his scarred face. He held a customized gold-plated 1911 pistol, aiming it casually in their direction. "A beautiful night for a scavenger hunt, isn't it?" Liam laughed, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "I have to thank Lorenzo. God rest his traitorous soul. He gave me just enough to put the pieces together." "Toss the case, Dominic, and maybe I'll let the pretty little waitress walk away. I hear she pours a decent cup of coffee." Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't raise his weapon. He slowly stood up, pulling Emily up behind him, shielding her entirely with his body. The pelican case dangled casually from his left hand. "You're making a profound mistake, Liam," Dominic said, his voice carrying over the wind, calm, resonant, and utterly devoid of fear. "You think this ledger just has my family's routing numbers? You think my father was just a senile old man hiding his pension?" Liam's smile faltered slightly. "Don't play games, Moretti. Toss the box." "Silas Moretti never lost his mind completely," Dominic continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "He used his diagnosis as a shield. He spent the last 2 years quietly gathering the bank records of your illicit side deals, Liam. The shipments you stole from the New York Commission, the money you skimmed from the Russian bratva in Brighton Beach. It's all in this case." Liam's face drained of color. "If the Commission or the Russians found out he was stealing from them, the O'Bannon syndicate would be violently dismantled within 24 hours. "Kill them," Liam roared, raising his gold pistol. "Kill them both, right now!" "Now, Carmine," Dominic said, softly into the microphone hidden in his lapel. Crack, crack, crack. The synchronized, suppressed rifle shots echoed like thunderclaps across the open park. Liam O'Bannon screamed as his gold-plated pistol was blown entirely out of his hand, taking 2 of his fingers with it. 3 of his top lieutenants dropped to the snow simultaneously, their knees shattered by precision sniper fire. Panic erupted. The remaining O'Bannon men scrambled for cover behind the escalades, realizing they had walked directly into a meticulously coordinated kill zone. Carmine and a team of 6 elite Moretti marksmen were positioned on the roof of the adjacent museum, their laser sights now painting Liam O'Bannon's chest with half a dozen glowing red dots. Dominic raised his own weapon, pointing it directly at Liam's head. "Tell your men to drop their weapons, Liam, or the next round goes through your left eye," Dominic commanded, his voice as cold as the ice beneath their feet. Trembling, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest, Liam fell to his knees in the snow. "Drop 'em!" he screamed to his men. "Drop the guns!" The clatter of heavy weaponry hitting the frozen pavement echoed through the plaza. The standoff was over in less than 60 seconds. The Moretti family had won. Dominic didn't wait for the police sirens that would inevitably follow. He grabbed Emily's hand, his grip warm and fiercely protective, and pulled her back toward the Audi. Once they were safely inside the heavily armored car, speeding away from the flashing lights of the approaching authorities, the massive adrenaline spike finally broke. Emily slumped back against the leather seat, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Dominic pulled the car over onto a dark, secluded side street overlooking the churning waters of the lake. He threw the car into park, unbuckled his seatbelt, and turned to her. Without a word, he reached out, his large hands gently framing her face. He brushed a stray, damp curl behind her ear, his thumb lightly grazing her bruised cheek. The cold, ruthless Mafia boss had vanished, leaving only a man stripped down to his most raw, desperate core. "You are a terrifying woman, Emily Higgins," Dominic whispered, his breath warm against her face. "You walked into a war zone for an old man you met 3 days ago. He needed help," Emily breathed, her eyes locked on his. "And so did you." Dominic let out a ragged exhale. "I have spent my entire life building walls, securing perimeters, trusting no one. And then you walked in, smelling of diner coffee and cheap wool, and burned the whole fortress to the ground." He didn't ask for permission. He closed the distance, pressing his lips to hers. The kiss was desperate, bruising, and tasted of adrenaline, winter rain, and undeniable permanence. Emily wrapped her hands into the lapels of his cashmere coat, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the storm that was Dominic Moretti. In that shadowed car, surrounded by the remnants of a shattered syndicate, Emily knew she was never going back to lose counter. The struggling waitress was dead. In her place, forged in the fires of loyalty and survival, stood the new queen of the Chicago underworld. Emily's simple act of compassion bridged 2 entirely different worlds, proving that humanity can flourish, even in the darkest, most dangerous corners of the city. Thrown into a life of crime, loyalty, and unexpected love, she transformed from a struggling waitress into the formidable heart of a dynasty, forever changing the legacy of the Moretti family through the sheer, unyielding power of an open heart.